Hello everyone, and welcome back to our next lab presentation. The topic of this lab video is the endocrine system. So you've probably started the endocrine system by now in your lecture class. However, a quick word of assurance, I will not be testing you on anything covered in any lecture class. The lab class is separate from the lecture class, and you'll only be responsible for the information in this presentation. However, if you have started the endocrine system in your lecture class, that will just be additionally helpful to you for the information presented in this presentation. So our goal with the endocrine system is to learn the different endocrine organs, what their secretory products are, and where they're found. For certain endocrine organs, we'll also be responsible for learning what the tissue looks like under the microscope. Those are the histological sections. 3 endocrine organs will be associated with these, namely the thyroid gland, the ovaries, and the testes. So let's jump right into the different endocrine organs that we need to know. On this slide, you will see a list of the 9 endocrine organs that you need to be aware of. We're not going to go over every single one of these, but we will cover most of them. Specifically, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are 2 components of the endocrine system that we're not going to discuss in major detail in this presentation. But I will give you a little bit of background on what the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are. So the hypothalamus can be found in the diencephalon. Specifically, this is the major homeostatic regulator of our entire body. And while the hypothalamus does many things for our body, one of its primary roles is to control the entire endocrine system. The endocrine system can be characterized into many different endocrine glands that all secrete hormones. Hormones, by definition, diffuse into the bloodstream and travel throughout the body to their target tissues in the bloodstream. And the hypothalamus is the component that controls everything else in this entire system. The hypothalamus is very closely associated with the pituitary gland. And so the hypothalamus will release certain releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones that will travel down to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, often referred to as our body's master gland, receives those releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus and then releases other hormones in response to the hormones from the hypothalamus. The hormones that the pituitary gland secretes travel out to the bloodstream and go and affect cells in each of these other endocrine organs. And this is what tells these endocrine organs to secrete their individual secretory products. Aside from learning where the pituitary gland is, we're not going to touch too much on this one. The thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, pineal gland, thymus, and the 2 sets of gonads are the endocrine glands that we're going to focus on primarily in this presentation. So let's first learn where all of these endocrine organs can be found, and then we'll start to get into their secretory products. So the hypothalamus is this region here shown in blue. We have the diencephalon that can be found in this region up here, and the hypothalamus hangs down below the diencephalon. There's a little stalk known as the infundibulum, and then this little red structure here is showing us the pituitary gland. There is, in fact, a posterior pituitary and an anterior pituitary, and each part of the pituitary gland releases different things. Again, you'll probably get more of this in your lecture course. But from the top down, we're going to see that there's many other endocrine organs that are found dispersed throughout the body, the first of which being the pineal gland. The pineal gland hangs from the roof of the 3rd ventricle, and it's primarily responsible for releasing the hormone melatonin. Melatonin is going to be a big player for helping regulate our body's circadian rhythms and helping us to sleep, which is why the pineal gland is one of my favorite endocrine organs. The thyroid gland is found here at the base of the neck, and on the back side of the thyroid gland, we'll find the parathyroid gland. These 2 glands are very, very closely associated with each other, and in fact, para means next to, or beside. Both the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland are going to play a major role in our body's calcium homeostasis. The parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone, and the thyroid gland will release calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone will function to increase blood levels of calcium, and calcitonin from the thyroid gland will help to decrease calcium levels when it gets too high. The thyroid gland has one other secretory product, and that is known as thyroid hormone. There are 2 types of thyroid hormone, known as T3 and T4. And thyroid hormone is referred to as our body's major metabolic hormone, as it increases our body's metabolic rate. Just below the parathyroid gland, we'll find the thymus. The thymus is mostly active when we're in early age. Specifically, the thymus releases certain hormones that help to educate a special cell that plays a role in our immune system known as T cells. So when we are young, our immune system is developing, and therefore the thymus will be very, very active in those early years. It tends to be less active as we get older, but we'll take a look at the roles of the thymus also. The adrenal glands, also known as the suprarenal glands because they're found just on top of the kidneys, can be found with a very intricate arrangement. There are two major layers of the adrenal glands, namely the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex has three other sublayers, and they're going to primarily be responsible for releasing hormones that help regulate our glucose homeostasis, help regulating our mineral homeostasis, and also help with development. We will break down these layers specifically at the end of this presentation. Just behind the stomach, we'll find the pancreas. The pancreas is one of my favorite organs in the entire body because it not only has an endocrine function, but it also has an exocrine function. Its endocrine function plays a major role in glucose homeostasis, regulating how much glucose can be found in the bloodstream. But its exocrine function will play a much greater role in the digestive system, which we will cover when we get to that chapter. Specifically, the pancreas will be releasing insulin that will help us to decrease blood glucose. And the last two endocrine organs we will discuss are the gonads. In males, the gonads are the testes, and in females, the gonads are the ovaries. The gonads will be responsible for releasing the sex hormones, such as testosterone and estrogen. We'll also see what these organs look like under the microscope. So now that you have a little bit of an idea of where each of these endocrine organs are found, we're going to start touching on each of these endocrine organs and discussing what their major secretory products are. You will also find that with the rest of the PowerPoint slides, each endocrine organ's location will be clearly written on that slide. So first and foremost, let's get into the pineal gland. The pineal gland, as I mentioned earlier, is found at the roof of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is contained within the diencephalon. And we see the diencephalon shown right here. And right towards the back, we'll find the pineal gland. The pineal gland is specifically found within a region of the diencephalon known as the epithalamus. And that is found here towards the back and towards the top of the diencephalon. Specifically, the pineal gland is attached here at the roof of the third ventricle. Now, the pineal gland plays a very important regulatory role in our body. It helps to regulate our sleep patterns, which is what melatonin is going to do. Melatonin is the hormone that is released from the pineal gland that makes us feel sleepy. Melatonin's production is actually inhibited by blue light, and this is why you're always told to get off your phone and your television 1 hour before bed. Without melatonin, we'd probably be a much grumpier species in general. The thymus is up next. The thymus can be found in a location known as the mediastinum. You might be wondering, where on earth is the mediastinum? The mediastinum is this little space that's found within the thoracic cavity that sits between the two lungs. It contains the heart, and the thymus sits just above it. So specifically, the thymus is found between the two lungs and right just above the heart. Again, as we get older, the thymus does tend to degrade a little bit. There are infiltrations of connective tissue and adipose that grow into the thymus as we get older. One of the thymus's big roles is to regulate T cell maturation. T cells are very hard-hitting immune cells, and as you make your way through Anatomy and Physiology 2, you'll eventually learn about the T cells. But what we need to understand is that T cells are going to be the major mediator of our body's immune response. They're going to be major players in destroying foreign things that have entered into the body. So we need to make sure that those T cells are programmed properly. And the hormones that come from the thymus are what are going to help program these T cells to become what's known as immunocompetent. Thymosin and thymopoietin are the two hormones that the thymus releases. In order for a cell to become immunocompetent, it needs to be able to recognize foreign substances and attack them, but at the same time recognize self-substances that are not foreign and not attack them. And it is the thymus that's primarily responsible for making sure that our T cells live up to both of those criteria. The thyroid gland is our next endocrine organ we're going to discuss. This is found here at the base of the neck. On the backside of the thyroid gland, we'll find these little spots, which are the parathyroid glands. And so from the thyroid gland, we have two secretory products, and from the parathyroid gland, we'll only have one. The thyroid gland often has two lobes, a right and a left, but sometimes it has this central lobe. and this lobe is referred to as the pyramidal lobe. I personally like to always go over the pyramidal lobe because to me, the thyroid gland, when it contains the pyramidal lobe, sort of looks like Batman's symbol. And I personally just really like the way that that looks. But oftentimes also the thyroid gland will only have two lobes, and there's no difference in function in somebody that has the pyramidal lobe and somebody that doesn't. So the thyroid gland specifically is found at the base of the neck, and the parathyroid gland can be found on the back side of the thyroid gland. Now in this picture, we're looking at a section of the thyroid gland. Under the microscope, this is what the thyroid tissue will look like. You can see these circular structures with this pink stuff that's found here in the center. Well, this circular structure is what's known as a thyroid follicle. A thyroid follicle is composed of cells that are wrapping around this pinkish center, known as follicular cells, and the stuff in the center is referred to as colloid. Colloid is stored thyroid hormone. So these cells can easily access this colloid and release thyroid hormone whenever they need to. We will also find other cells that can be found between the follicles, and those are known as parafollicular cells. So we have the follicular cells that wrap around and make up the thyroid follicle, and the parafollicular cells that are found right next to the thyroid follicle. And each of these two cells will be responsible for releasing the two different hormones that come from the thyroid gland. So specifically, the thyroid gland releases two hormones, thyroid hormone and calcitonin. The follicular cells, the ones that have access to the colloid or stored thyroid hormone, will be the ones that release thyroid hormone. This is our body's major metabolic hormone. But those parafollicular cells, also known as C cells, and I prefer to call them C cells because of their secretory product, are going to be the ones that release calcitonin. And calcitonin is going to be a very important regulator of our body's blood calcium homeostasis. When blood calcium goes too high, calcitonin is released and it stimulates and inhibits different cells that will eventually lead to the decrease in blood calcium. Specifically, our osteoclasts are going to be inhibited by calcitonin. Osteoclasts are bone cells that specifically break down bone and release calcium into the blood. So by preventing the action of the osteoclasts, that's going to lead to a decrease in our calcium levels. So again, I prefer to call these C cells because C cells are the ones that release calcitonin. But I do want you to be comfortable with this name as well. These are the follicular cells that release the thyroid hormone, and the parafollicular cells are going to release calcitonin. This is another picture just to show you these thyroid follicular cells that wrap around the colloid and the parafollicular cells that are found in between. The parathyroid gland, which is found on the back side of the thyroid gland, releases parathyroid hormone. This is an easy one to remember, but something that we don't want to mix up is the parafollicular cells are found in the thyroid gland, not in the parathyroid gland. Because of the terminology, it can be easy to get those mixed up. So do not get confused with the parafollicular cells. We have the parathyroid gland that releases parathyroid hormone. And the parafollicular cells, those are found in the thyroid gland, and they're releasing calcitonin. Now the parafollicular cells, as well as the cells of the thyroid gland, will both be participating in calcium homeostasis. Parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland is going to increase our body's calcium absorption, which helps to increase our levels of calcium in the blood. So if calcium gets too high, we can stimulate the parafollicular cells to release calcitonin, which will eventually decrease our calcium levels back to a normal range. But if calcium gets too low, we can stimulate the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland, and that will stimulate factors that will increase blood calcium levels. So we're now going to talk about my absolute favorite endocrine organ, and that is the pancreas. I personally love the pancreas so much because it plays a role in two of our systems, namely the endocrine system and the digestive system. Remember, endocrine means that we're releasing hormones into the bloodstream. So our endocrine organs will always have a very good blood supply. But exocrine means something entirely different. Exocrine glands release their secretory products into ducts, and those ducts empty out onto some type of surface or into some type of cavity. So the pancreas has two major portions, an endocrine portion and an exocrine portion, that will both be responsible for different things. The endocrine portion of the pancreas is what we're going to focus on in this presentation as we're talking about the endocrine system. And the exocrine function of the pancreas will be discussed when we get to the digestive system. But in particular, the endocrine portion of the pancreas is known as the islets of Langerhans. These are also called islands of Langerhans, and they are these little lightly staining regions inside of the pancreas that contain a very special cell known as beta cells. The beta pancreatic cells, among others, can be found in the islets of Langerhans, and it is these specific cells that will release the hormone insulin. Insulin is going to help to decrease blood glucose. So after that piece of chocolate cake that you may have after dinner, the beta pancreatic cells will go into action and release insulin to decrease blood glucose and to promote glucose transport into the cells. One other thing that we'll see about the endocrine portion of the pancreas is we have another cell known as alpha cells. And those alpha cells will release a hormone known as glucagon. And glucagon will actually function to increase blood glucose in the case of starvation or fasting. The pancreas specifically can be found in the abdominal cavity located just behind the stomach. The next endocrine organ to be discussed are the gonads. We'll first go over the testes and then we'll go over the ovaries. Now the gonads play a role in more than just one body system. In particular, the testes and the ovaries will be part of the endocrine system, but they're also going to play a major role in the reproductive system also. Specifically, we're going to discuss their endocrine function, which focuses on the hormones that these release. The gonads will also be very important for the development of the gametes, also known as the sex cells, but we're not going to discuss that role of these organs in this presentation. We'll start to learn about those roles when we get into the reproductive systems. But in particular, the testes and the ovaries are going to release the sex hormones. The testes in particular will release the hormone testosterone. And it's a very special cell that does this. These cells here are known as interstitial cells of Leydig, also known as the Leydig cells. And it is these cells that are going to be the ones that will release testosterone into the bloodstream. You'll see in this picture that we're looking at a structure known as seminiferous tubules. And so I've placed this slide here so that we can see exactly where the section is that we're looking at. The structure of the testes is loosely shown on this slide. The seminiferous tubules can be found right in here. And it is inside of the seminiferous tubules that will have the production of sperm cells. I will want you to be able to identify the testes and also distinguish this tissue from the ovaries as well as the thyroid gland. But don't worry too much right now about these different cells. We'll talk more about those when we get to the reproductive system. You want to focus on these interstitial cells of Leydig, which are going to release testosterone. They do this in response to another hormone known as LH, luteinizing hormone as it's also called, and that hormone comes up from the anterior pituitary gland. So when the anterior pituitary releases LH and it travels to the testes through the bloodstream, these Leydig cells are going to then release testosterone in response. The ovaries are the second to last endocrine organ that we're going to go over. Now, with the ovaries in particular, we have to remember that this organ is part of both the endocrine system and the reproductive system. So inside of the ovaries, there's going to be a maturation of what are known as follicles. These follicles will be developing and will eventually release the egg cell, also known as the oocyte, through the process of ovulation. There is quite a bit of anatomy that goes into the Graafian follicle. So we just want to focus on the specific parts that are relevant to the endocrine system. And this will be the follicular cells as well as what's known as the corpus luteum. You can see on this slide we have the oocyte found in here, its little nucleus found in the center of the cell, and a couple other structures that are found in here also. But what you're looking at is an ovarian follicle. Very similar to the thyroid gland, the follicular cells are found around the ovarian follicle, and these are the cells that are going to be releasing estrogen. This is the female sex hormone. As the follicle develops, it's eventually going to be ready to release this oocyte out through ovulation. And when this happens, the remnants of this follicle become a structure known as the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is primarily going to be responsible for releasing progesterone. So we have estrogen and progesterone that are coming from the ovaries. Again, focus on the endocrine function of this. We'll go over the physiology of the reproductive portion when we get to that chapter. The last endocrine organ to be discussed is the adrenal gland. I prefer to call the adrenal gland the suprarenal gland because it's found superior to the kidneys, but I will refer to it as the adrenal gland since this is its more common name. You can see the structure of the adrenal gland has two major layers, the outer cortex and the inner medulla. The cortex here wraps around the medulla, and different things come from different layers. we're going to see that the cortex actually has three other layers that can be found within it: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. These three layers are organized from superficial to deep. The zona glomerulosa is the most superficial layer, and the zona reticularis is the deepest layer of the adrenal cortex that will contact the adrenal medulla. Now, different classes of molecules are released from each of these different layers. The zona glomerulosa, which is our most superficial layer, will release a group of chemicals known as mineralocorticoids. One of the major mineralocorticoids that you'll likely hear about in your lecture class is aldosterone. Mineralocorticoids, as they sound, will control and regulate mineral homeostasis. So that speaks to aldosterone's role of increasing sodium absorption in the kidneys. We will find the zona fasciculata, which will be responsible for releasing a class of molecules known as glucocorticoids, named as such because these will help regulate glucose homeostasis. There are many different glucocorticoids, but one that we need to know in particular is cortisol. Cortisol is also known as the stress hormone and plays a big role in maintaining glucose homeostasis. The zona reticularis is our final layer of the adrenal cortex, and this releases androgens. The major androgen that comes from the zona reticularis is known as dihydroepiandrosterone, but you can abbreviate that as DHEA. Androgens are a class of chemicals that include testosterone. The last layer of the adrenal gland is the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla is essentially a modified sympathetic ganglion. This adrenal medulla is an extremely important component of our body's autonomic nervous system. The adrenal medulla releases a class of molecules known as catecholamines, and catecholamines refer to our epinephrine and norepinephrine. Oftentimes, epinephrine is called adrenaline, and norepinephrine is called noradrenaline. And these both have a sympathetic effect on the body. They increase body activity. And as the adrenal medulla releases these into the bloodstream, that causes a systemic effect. So that will conclude our presentation on the endocrine system. If you have any questions at all, please make sure to reach out to me on the inbox on Canvas.